Hi folks, welcome to the next session of our VAN 201 training. Today we're going to be talking about using models when it comes to targeting and go into a little bit of an overview about the KDP models. Uh, After the end of this, hopefully folks have a better idea of the various types of models out there, what type they can expect to have access to uh, in the upcoming cycle, and and have some additional types of universes that they can build out and some various ways to think about building said universes. So let's just go into the agenda. So very first thing we're going to talk about is sort of going over what we discussed when it came to campaign planning and how that's going to impact how you use models to build your universes. A model refresher, that way folks get a overview of what these models are, again, how they're built, things of that nature, how they're supposed to be used. We'll talk about some common model types, what they actually mean, how to use them, things like that. We'll do a little bit of an overview of our KDP turnout models. That way folks can know the value that they add. We'll talk about the models that are most commonly shared to campaigns during a cycle. We'll talk about sort of what's being shared out now. This will be the very first question or models and scores that campaigns have, and then as the cycle ramps up, of course, a lot more models will be pumped into Vote Builder for campaigns to use. Then we're just going to go over some universe building exercises. That way we can think of a few scenarios, go how to execute those scenarios, and get what we want. So with that, let's just dive in. Again, for the campaign, when it came to the campaign plans that we had, those district profiles hopefully give campaigns and candidates the basic information that's needed to build their plans. So baseline and turnout number, a win number, base numbers. That way you can calculate get an idea of how many voters are going to turn out, what your win number is, how many votes you're likely going to get from your base, how many votes the Republicans are going to get from their base, and then use all of that to get your vote deficit to know how many votes do I need to get over the top. And since we have these numbers when it comes to using models, building your universe, knowing these numbers is going to be very influential when it comes to your targeting. So these numbers are going to help you build your universe to get to and ultimately above your win number. You want to have more folks in your universe than your win number because, again, not everyone is necessarily going to support you. And you want to make sure you are able to have a universe that will sort of be larger. That way you go into your campaign with that thought of, here's how many folks I have, here's how many folks I need, that type of mindset. And then once you have your universe, just being able to segment it out. So the most common segments we're going to talk about are persuasion, mobilization, GOTV targets, to name a few. We'll talk about a few more and how to even do subsets of your subsets here in a little bit. So that's kind of some of the things to keep in mind of how the campaign plan is going to be flow into this training and be useful to this training. And before we get into all the fun about models, let's just go over what a model is. A model produces a score that makes targeting easier at scale. Models take in a lot of information to be able to find correlations among various data points that help predict a known problem. Something that is known that can then be predicted, that can then predict a probability. So we'll talk about what that actually means when we go into the KDP models here in a few minutes. Traditionally, political scores are on a 0 to 100 scale. So if it's a number closer to 100, that means it's more likely to happen. Closer to 0, never or not very likely to happen. And just keep in mind, scores are a probability. The likelihood something's going to happen, not an intensity. So you might always vote Democrat but your score might be a 50, 55, 60. That's just saying of for instance, a person with a 50 score, we'd expect 50 to vote Democrat, 50 to vote Republican. And one of the things that I do sort of want to make sure folks know, especially when we talk about the importance of the KDP models, when it comes to when it comes to models and scores, those are things that are really costly to campaigns. When I was looking at turnout models and how much those cost, I got basically a message saying that for one vendor, a custom state turnout model is at least $30,000 to $50,000. So definitely something that is not in the budget of a lot of our local or state legislative candidates. Maybe not even in the budget range for some of our congressional candidates, but being able to build these in-house is that much of an investment into our candidates up and down the ticket. So what are some of the most common models that you're going to see, run into, and probably use? First and foremost, a support score. The likelihood a voter will support a given candidate or issue, but we'll talk about issue a little bit. But candidate or party support score, main one folks are going to use. So again, sort of like I said a second ago, if we have 100 voters and they all have a 50 Democratic support score, we'd expect about 50 of those folks to vote for the Democratic candidate. And one thing I do want to highlight, and we'll have some illustrations that hammer this in a little bit later in the slides. Scores towards the middle means mean the model is uncertain about the voter. So that's going to be very important to keep in mind when you think about persuasion and how to target folks for that. The next one is going to be turnout scores. The likelihood a voter will turn out in a given election. These are usually based upon, built and validated upon previous vote history. Next, issue scores, very similar to support scores. So these are the likelihood a voter is going to support a given issue stance or message. And then persuasion scores. This is probably the one that's going to be is majorly different. So these are usually on a positive or a negative to a positive scale. So some that the DCCC have built out are a -7 to 7, for instance. So these scores are used to determine the likelihood that a given message will have a negative or positive impact on a voter. A negative impact, for instance, with a persuasion score means they're less likely to vote for a Democrat. A positive score means they're more likely to vote for a Democrat. And these are the ones that are a little tricky to use, but these are definitely very useful if you do have access to them. So now that we've given folks an overview of what they'll run into, let's talk about the Kentucky Democrats turnout models that we've created in-house. So again, created by KDP. These are meant to give our campaigns access to a higher quality turnout model than what's built nationally, because national models are not necessarily built state by state. They're built at the national level and then segmented out to states, versus these scores that are built and validated with Kentucky-specific data. Means it's going to be a little bit more in tune with the state, how things are going, and things like that. So these scores with these scores being built and administered by KDP, that gives us the ability to score new registrants quicker and even perform model updates more quickly than if it was created and distributed by a national vendor. So the best example I have here is for the 2022 general turnout model. That will get a sort of rebuild after we have 2022 primary vote data to be able to hopefully make the model score folks that are newer registrants a little bit better now that we know they've actually voted in a primary, and they have some vote history to their name. So so the thought is if someone voted in the primary, they're more likely to vote in the general. That'll be taken into consideration, considering we can update the model with that information as soon as we get it versus waiting for another vendor to do it. Right now, the models that we have are a midterm and a midterm general and a midterm primary turnout score. Still working on documentation for an absentee early vote likelihood that has been rebuilt from a score that was available in 2020. That looks like it'll validate pretty well with what we'd expect now that we have some expanded voting options. Still working on that documentation that'll be given out to folks. But that's a little bit of an overview of what these models are, why they were built, and why Kentucky specific is better than national. Then we're just going to talk a little bit about the building process. That way folks have an idea, and there's going to be a link to the actual slide deck that is more in-depth for folks that want to look through it. So with that, these turnout models were built using historical data, along with various political, consumer, and demographic data. The biggest indicator, of course, for turnout is previous vote history. So the vote history that we have was basically built and validated on 2018 vote history to make sure, hey, these are the people that we know have voted in a recent midterm, and then utilize that information to build this model, validated well, and then once the model was built to validate it, it was ran against holdout data. So we did a very small sample of eligible voters in the 2018 primary to build the model, validated against the rest of the voter file from there. It validated pretty darn well, and like I said, previous vote history was the strongest weight in the this model that sort of was the largest predictor of this model when it came to the scores, and then after that it was the DNC college grad score. So if you're a frequent voter and you have if you're a frequent voter and then your education level are usually were sort of the two biggest weights when it came to someone's likelihood to vote per the model. For a full training on how these models were built, the link here is our slide deck that goes through it, shows some validation, shows that what you would expect from each score range was what you would expect. So for instance, folks that were in the 90 plus range, the models were actually showing about 95% of folks in that range did actually vote in the 2018 midterm. And then we have some documentation available for the primary and general available here that folks will be able to view as well to see how the model was built. And these two correspond pretty well to each other and giving folks a very in-depth overview of the model building process. Next, we have KDP ranks. So these are located in the scores section in Vote Builder and are shared with everyone, but these aren't models or scores. This is a density rank. That way folks know what the densest precincts in their county and or in the state are. So how this was built is we took the total number of voters. We calculated the total number of voters per square mile, and that information. And if you look in the documentation we have down here on this page, that'll give you what all of that was. Once we had that calculated figure of people per square mile, each precinct was then ranked in the state, so 1 to 3,000 something, and then from that number we put it on a 0 to 100 scale. So precincts closer to 100 are more dense. Those closest to 0 are the least dense. So the most dense precinct would have a 100 score, and then it would rank those down, rank number 2, 3, 4, right under that, so on and so forth, to be on that 0 to 100 scale. And these ranks are going to be things that are helpful to campaigns when it comes to prioritizing the densest precincts that they want to knock. If you have, if you're in a very urban area, or even an area that's urban, suburban, and rural, you could say, hey, I want to knock the most dense precincts. I want the precincts that are in the 75th percentile rank or higher to go knock. That way, you're having your volunteers knock precincts that are going to be more dense. Or on the flip side of that, if you want to target precincts that you can't knock but you want to call, you can use the lower scores to find out which precincts those are. For more information on the ranks, you can visit the link down here and see that documentation as well as the statewide map. So now that we've talked about what's available and what's been created through KDP, we're going to talk about what some of the shared models are and who those vendors are. Each cycle, the DNC and various vendors build out models, share those through the DNC for our users. So as the cycle goes on, you can expect to see more and more of these models made available. They come from a variety of analytics vendors, and most are, like I said, purchased by the DNC for states. So some of the ones that you might see most commonly are going to be things like are going to be built by TargetSmart, Clarity, the DNC themselves, Blue Labs, DEC, Civis, the DCCC/DSCC, and DLCC will build and share models as well. So those are the most common vendors that'll be building these shared models. And now just talking about what some of the support models that you'll see. Again, these were basically what was available in 2020 that we're sort of using as a cornerstone for folks that are starting to announce their campaigns while we wait on 2022 scores to be made. So the ones that folks will have access to are going to be the DNC Dem Support Score. So this predicts the likelihood a voter is going to support a Democratic candidate over a Republican candidate. So these aren't candidate specific. These are just likelihood of supporting a Democrat over a Republican in a head-to-head race. Next, we have the 2020 DLCC State House and State Senate support. So these, very much like the Dem support score, are predicting the likelihood a Democratic candidate for State House or State Senate predicts the likelihood a voter will support that candidate over their Republican opponent. Again, these are both built by their respective organizations. They might be a little bit different based upon the polling data that's available. The one thing that differentiates the DNC score from the DLCCs and other scores is it does pull in vote builder survey data to help hone the model. The DNC score is shared with all committees, all candidates, whether you're running for Congress, State House, State Senate, local race. The DLCC score is shared with folks in their respective races. So folks for State House get the State House score. Folks for State Senate get the State Senate score. That way they can use that model in respects to the race they are running. Next, something that will be beneficial is the 2022 TargetSmart Trump support score. So this was built for the 2020 election to predict the likelihood a voter is supporting Donald Trump. This might be a good score to help wean out folks that would be more likely to be Trump supporters. That way you don't have to necessarily talk to them. Just one idea for folks to help making canvassing a little bit easier, or voter contact overall a lot easier for their candidates, and make sure they're spending resources on candidates that will actually support Democrats and not Republicans. Next are demographic models. So these are really important in Kentucky because it provides is an attempt to provide data that's missing from our voter file. So race, ethnicity data are not available on the Kentucky file. So things like the 2018 Civis race and 2018 Target Smart ethnicity score, while they were built in 2018, they pretty much stay consistent versus a support model, which would be built for a specific cycle. So the Civis race predicts an individual's likely race with the ability to select on low, medium, or high likelihoods. These are built on voter file and high quality public data and survey data, and then validated on alignment with actual geographic concentrations to make sure, like, would we expect folks of this race to actually be in these geographic areas. Ethnicity data does a very similar thing. It predicts a voter's ethnicity with what they would likely most identify as. It's built on census data, so the person's location and their last name to determine likely ethnicity. So would we expect there to be large concentrations of that ethnicity in that specific location? And since these are missing from census information isn't necessarily on our file, this is a good way to sort of hone in your targeting, create some different outreach programs, and help with message development. Miscellaneous scores, so these are things that you'll see but are don't fit into either of the previous categories. So a DNC volunteer propensity score is built and intended to help campaigns and party committees identify the most promising targets for volunteer recruitment. It was constructed using volunteer history data through the 2018 election. There will be a new version for 2022. I would expect that will incorporate 2020 data through 2020. So this is going to be useful for expanding your volunteer base. Always recruit volunteers from your actual signups, but once you've expended those, you can use the volunteer propensity score to start looking for additional volunteers. At times, this score might feel like you're scraping the bottom of the barrel, but it should at least be helpful in expanding your volunteer base. Next, we have the 2020 DNC College Grad Score. So this predicts the likelihood a voter has a 4-year degree. So it's using a variety of data sources like historic survey data, consumer data, and precinct-level census data to hone that prediction. Issue support scores. So these don't really have any specific ones in mind right now, but but sort of like we said with support scores, it's the likelihood a voter is going to support a specific issue or message surrounding an issue. And these are good for when it comes to persuasion to help identify who those good targets might be. So the last two, contactability scores, aka sonar scores or phone quality scores in Vote Builder. So these are built by the DNC. They're automatically shared in Vote Builder in the phone section. So this score is to help campaigns find the best person-phone number combo to attempt to reach a voter. That way, folks that have higher scores, for instance, you're more likely to get a hold of them. I'll show a graphic of what all this means here in a few minutes. And then there's additionally a textable phones only that ranks the best cell phone on a person's record when it comes time to text that voter. And then last but not least, sort of like I was talking about with the issue support scores, we have persuasion scores. Again, usually on a negative to positive scale. Negative means less likely to support a Democrat with that message. Positive is more likely to move into supporting a Democrat. With these scores, it's really determining how much of an impact will a persuasion message have on a voter. So the So at 0, basically no effect. If you start going to negative, that means, like I said, like more likely to have a negative impact with that voter. As you go further on the positive side, more likely to have a positive impact on getting that person to vote for a Democrat. So those are some of the common scores that you will see and have access to and sort of how they can be used. Next, we're going to talk about universe building thoughts. These are just some high-level overview of things to think about before we move into some exercises. So first and foremost, know what your expected turnout is, how many voters, and what your win number are. You're going to want to make sure you're building your universe larger than your win number. Because, again, not everyone in your universe is going to support you, and you need to make sure you're weeding those folks out, still having conversations with folks you haven't talked to, or moving your undecideds to supporters, and making sure you have a large enough universe to make that happen by a comfortable margin. When it comes to your universe, a good recommendation is always have one base universe. This is going to be all the targets you want to talk to. And then from there, you can create subsets like the persuasion, mobilization, and GOTV universes. Then within these subsets, you can even create more subsets to prioritize resources. So folks that might be in your persuasion universe, for instance, there might be folks that'll be easier to persuade or easier to reach, and you want to make sure you talk to them. And then if you have enough capacity, folks that might be folks that you'd be able to persuade, but they might be a little bit harder, would be in your mid-tier. And then folks that might have marginal scores would be like a third persuasion universe. So basically, trying to make sure you're prioritizing your resources, or I would say mobilization would be a better thing. Say they are very high support but very low turnout or middling turnout. You want to make sure those folks vote. They're more likely to vote. And then you still might have folks that have high support scores but they have lower turnout scores. You'd want to make sure those folks might be your GOTV universe. So like create subsets and subsets. That way you are spending your capacity and resources wisely. And another thing, keep the district in mind and your connection to it. Do you have real good connections in one county? You might be able to widen your universe in that county. So if you were a former principal, educator, if you played sports in high school and did really well, like those might be some reasons to say, like, folks know my name here. They have a good, they think highly of me. You might be able to widen your universe in that county and be able to sway some of those voters that might not necessarily vote for another Democrat. Another thing when keeping the district in mind, what is the demographic breakdown? So are there going to be Hispanic, African-American voters that you might need to reach? How will you get into those communities to have conversations with those folks, build that trust to get them out to vote for you? Those are a few things to keep in mind. Usually a little bit more concrete thoughts when it comes to creating your baseline universe. Start with turnout and support models combined. I usually do like a 30 plus support, 30 plus turnout. That usually will get you close to or above your win number. Then you can add and remove voters based upon things like historical data, Democrat IDs, Republican IDs, micro targets. Are there demographics that you want to reach? Do you think you're going to do well with younger voters? You can add in more of those folks. Occupations, are you a former educator? Do you feel comfortable having persuasion conversations or conversations with fellow educators to get out the vote? Include new reg. Folks that have not had the opportunity to vote, they're probably going to be a little bit lower in turnout scores. So include those folks, give them a touch to make sure that they have a higher likelihood of turning out. Knock on wood. Things like that are a few things I would say to keep in mind when building your universes. And now, sort of to help folks think things through, we're not going to build an entire universe from scratch, but I want folks to have a couple of ideas of what some scenarios might be and how you can use various models to do that. Here is also one of the photos that I said I want folks to keep in mind when it comes to folks that are in middle partisanship scores. Like we said, those folks we don't know as much data about. That's the reason they're in the middle. So so don't just purely target folks in these scores for persuasion. This is the probability they'll vote for a Democrat. Not that they're persuadable, but you can augment those scores with persuasion scores, issue support scores to find who those best folks would be to talk to. So keep that in mind. And now, so for some of the target exercises that we're going to go through, one is how would you use scores to expand your volunteer base? Another is, like I was just talking about with persuasion, what are the best targets for a persuasion program? Another is, say you have your universe, how are you going to separate it into the best phones to call and phones to text? And then how are you going to identify the best precincts for a large day of action? So moving into the first prompt, expanding the volunteer base. So let's say your campaign has expanded its volunteer capacity. You need to increase capacity. You're heading into the final month of the election. What available options are there to identify these voters? So as you can see over here, I'm using Congressional District 4. So the general overview would be talk to folks that have a high support and a high volunteer propensity, and you can optionally, if you need to narrow that down, have a high turnout. So these are with the high support, they're more likely to support Democrats. High turnout, they're probably going to vote, so that means they're more engaged. High volunteer propensity, they have a higher likelihood of volunteering for you, and you can adjust as needed. So I'm going to move over to Vote Builder real quick, and we're just going to go through this list, see what those numbers might look like in a few different places. That way we can get an idea of what all of this means. So let's just start in CD4. So the district has over 583,000 folks. Obviously, we're wanting to do targeting because we can't reach all of those folks. So let's just say we want to, again, still find the best volunteer prospects. So let's just start with a 95 DIM support score. 2,000 people, but that doesn't mean all of them are likely to volunteer or likely to turn out. So let's just start with going to the volunteer propensity. Vol prop. So if we just do 95, 331 folks in the district have a high support score, high propensity to volunteer score. So these would be really, really good folks to turn out. And let's say you wanted to make sure they are a little bit more engaged, that they're actual voters. You can throw in a 90 support score. That only drops it by a little over 100. So these would be some really good targets to start thinking about, to have this conversation of, hey, I'm with this congressional candidate. We are in the final month of the election. We have a great shot to beat Thomas Massie. Can you help us get out the vote? And these would be good folks to have that conversation with. However, if you didn't do that and you just did everyone in the district that has a 95 overall, that's closer to 4,000 people. So depending upon your capacity, make adjustments as needed to make sure you're talking to folks. I definitely always advise using the support score. That way you know you're actually talking to folks that are on the higher end of the spectrum when it comes to support versus calling someone that might be under a 20. And let's see what that might look like. So 88 people have a 95 or higher volunteer propensity score, but they have a support score under 20. Probably not folks we want to talk to based upon the model and what we know about it. So that's sort of the reason I say combine this with a couple other scores to make sure you're talking to the best folks possible. Next, persuasion targeting. We have another screenshot of AJ saying mid-range support scores are not persuadable voters. So keep that in mind. So with this, the campaign wants to target voters who can be most swayed by the most important issues of their platform. So let's just say that's supporting public education, supporting labor, supporting expanding healthcare. So just some targeting thoughts with this. Utilize your existing universe, start there, and narrow using individual issue or persuasion scores to create these subsets. If the subset is too small to knock, for instance, you might want to continue adding layers to make the universe a little bit larger for persuasion. So I'm now going to go back over in the vote builder, but we're going to just basically start. I'm going to build a sample universe for HD45. So we're going to use a 30 to 74.99 support score, 30 plus turnout score. We're going to build out a couple of these subsets together. So the first one is going to be likelihood of being supporting public education. So let me go back to scores. So again, we're just going to start 30 to 74.99 with a 30 plus turnout score. That's 1,000 or 4,151 people. So that's still a good persuasion universe to start with, but how do we make sure they're actually folks that would be good targets? So the public education subset, instead of using a model, we have some publicly available data that we got that was made in 2018 for the 18 public education employees, and then from this summer for the 2021 public education employees. So we're going to use those activist codes to find those people. So I'm going to go up to activist codes, go to the drop down, and since we need to select two, I'm just going to select activist code. That's going to have them all pop up. So 81, 18, and 21, select those. So now if I hit refresh, we'll see activist codes are in there, and we can hit preview results. So in this persuasion universe, the public education segment is only 185 people. That is not a lot of voters. So we need to continue adding in additional folks. So we can now add in an additional step, say, yeah, I'm going to continue expanding my universe. Start with HD45 and those scores we were talking about. Not targets. So 30 to 74.99, 30 plus turnout. Again, when I do that, it's going to get us back up to that 4151 number. So again, we want to segment out using a issue support score. So we're going to find the Target Smart labor union support, which is buried under here. And we're just going to say 75. That way these folks, 75 out of 100 or greater, are likely to actually support unions. Add that step on, we go from 185 up to 1,971. That added in, it does have some overlap, so it adds in 1,865 voters. And now, that's a good size, but we want it to be a little bit larger, and we want to make sure we're talking to folks that will care about healthcare. So, again, House District 45, 30 to 74.99 score, 30 plus turnout. I think you all know if I hit preview my results, it's going to be 4151. Great. So we're still targeting the same folks. And now we want to go to a score that is focused on healthcare. So we're going to narrow to a positive persuasion score, and I'm going to just do a 2 plus with this one, which is going to be, I believe, not the D-trip. Let me double check. It's not the D-trip, so it's the Civis Healthcare Persuasion. 2 to 10 gets us up to 3828. Adds in close to 2,300 voters. There have been some changes, it looks like, since I last did this. So the total universe, when I built the deck, was 3,858 folks. Now it's 3,828, so we lost 30 people somewhere. But this is a larger universe than the 150 or the 1900, and is probably a good universe to talk to for persuasion, and is about 92-93% coverage of the initial universe that we had. And I'm just going to go back here, and we're going to see this steps all the way through. I did it in a bit different order, but this are the steps and an idea of how to build out the framework to identify these folks. So that was one way, and we're just going to keep this list as our main list to use for our next thing. So let's say this list, we wanted to go ahead and identify the best phone numbers to call and text. So the campaign has a tight budget for paid calls and text for persuasion. What can be done to ensure the call and text lists that we give the vendor are the best voters and numbers to contact? So from the existing universe for calls, we're just going to narrow to folks that have a specific set of score buckets to get the intended universe size. Let's say I only have enough money for 2,500 calls and 2,000 text. So we're at 3828, and we need to go ahead and narrow. So we're going to try and get 2,500, the 2,500 best people and phones. So one thing that we can do is not empty. 3,050. So how do we get the best phone numbers? Let's just start with the top 3 buckets. 3,000. So it's still a pretty large universe, larger than what we need. So let's say high and very high, a little bit over. So what if I just take out very high? A little under, but let's just go back and add high. We can run these numbers again. 28,868 people, 2,600 phones. That will, it's a little bit over. It'll probably be fine. They'll do some deduping, things like that. So let's say, for instance, this was going to be a robocall. We can add this in with likely not a sell and not a sell, which means, oh dear, we're at 1,500 people almost. So we can add in a few additional layers and still have it. So what this is basically showing is, here's how we can use the contactability scores to narrow folks. So can't get exactly at 2,500, but at least with the very high and very high, high and very high, we're at 2,800. Good enough to get where we need to. Now, let's say that's the universe. We go over, send to our vendor. We also need to identify text. We need the top 2,000 to send to. So from here, we can just keep the criteria that we have and select textable phones only, which is identifying that people have a good cell phone to text. So if we do textable phones, we're at 2,100 phones. Let's just say we take out high in this instance, 1,390. Still a little too much, but we already know we're given folks that have a high, very high, a call, so we could always see, like, what if we did high and medium? Whew. That is a lot less. So yeah, let's just say we did this. Again, we're not getting close to the number we're looking for, but at least we're getting close to say, hey, this is probably going to be close to 2,000 textable numbers. So again, with these, we're just trying to optimize the call list, make sure we are we're reaching out to phone numbers that are more likely to result in a contact. And again, no matter what your universe is, as long as you go through this section under phones, you'll be able to narrow on phone quality and textable phone scores. And here, this is just a overview of what we actually mean by these scores, as well as how they've performed in Kentucky. So, for instance, if you are just targeting the scores in the very high range, your expected success rate or canvas rates expected to be 4.6% with a 1.3% wrong number. If you use the top two, high and very high, you're going to get a 3.4% contact rate, 2.2 wrong number. However, if you were to use no score and you just targeted everyone, you'd only have a 2.6 canvas rate, and you'd have a much higher, a 4.5% wrong number rate. And just looking here at Kentucky scores, this here is a no score. You'll see that a lot of our attempts were in the medium through very high ranges, and our contact percent over here was pretty high, and what we'd sort of expect in those ranges. So in the very high range, this one where we're supposed to have 4.6, we probably had about a 13% contact rate. Our high, we were at about 9. Medium, we're probably at about 7. While in very low scores, we had like a 4% contact rate. And that was probably about tied for the highest at about a 2% wrong number rate. So more or less, it's not exactly showing what we're seeing over here based upon DNC expectations, but here's like the actual numbers that we have, and it does show the expectations that we're going to get more contacts in our higher ranges and less in our lower ranges does hold up. So with this, we're moving on to our last exercise. So with this one, let's say the campaign is preparing for a large day of action. You have over 50 volunteers that are confirmed. And as the campaign, you want to make sure your volunteers are knocking the most doors possible. So with this, the best way to think about that is, of course, you want to make sure you have your universe, and you can use from there, you can narrow to the most dense precincts using the KDP precinct density rank to identify these voters and precincts. So, for instance, let's just create a new list. Let's just say we're knocking in CD4 now. And we are using the 30 plus support, 30 plus turnout. We have 134,785 folks. So from there, we want to talk to the folks that are in the densest precincts. We would add a step or include it in this step, the precinct density. So let's say 75th percentile or higher precincts. Takes us to 35,000 voters. We have 50 volunteers. That's pretty much a lot. What happens if we do a 90? That's still a lot. So let's say we did a 9 to 5. 95 there, and let's say 90 here. Great. That probably looks a lot more doable for 50 volunteers. And then from here, this is basically saying we want if it's a within the county, it's a precinct that's in the 95th percentile or higher, and statewide 90 or higher. We want to knock those doors. So, like I said, um, this is helping narrow specific precincts, while the score or rank is applied to individual voters. Voters within the same precinct are going to have the same precinct ranks. Start with a higher number at either the statewide or countywide ranking and go down as much as you need. And again, 0 is least dense, likely rural areas. Closer to 100 is more dense, likely urban areas or apartment complexes. So if we ran this list, we can just run the search. Let's see where these are at on the turf. For instance, we're not going to do any cutting, but I would expect a lot of northern Kentucky, Ashland, northern Kentucky. So now that we've got that, let's just go back to my list, and we can do a quick counts and crosstabs to see the county and precincts. So let's do county. And precinct. And refresh our results. And while there are some that have won, these means these folks have moved on our most recent voter file update. Once the score is refreshed, it'll be updated. But these precincts that we are having and seeing here are the most dense precincts in their area and have a lot more people in our universe. So they're going to be a lot easier to knock. So let's say we wanted to do Boyd, Grayson, Spring Hill. Let's just go narrow. Boyd, Grayson, Spring Hill. And we're going to run this search to that precinct. We'll now see we have 255 people, 188 doors, cut the turf, and you can just go to town cutting turf in this precinct to give to your canvassers. And we'll just say down, This is not a turf cutting exercise, but hopefully this gives folks an idea of these folks will be in areas that are going to be easy to walk for our volunteers and helps identify those areas a little bit better than having to look at a map. So those are a few of the exercises that we had. Hopefully this gives folks an idea of what models mean, how to use them. Again, there are tons of models that are out there. Being able to know the ones to use and what they actually do is important. When building your universe, again, know your win number, know your vote deficit to help build those out. And as folks take the quiz for this section, we'll have a few prompts and scenarios. So start thinking about different scenarios and how to target those voters for the quiz. With that, I know this has been a longer training, so I'll let folks go ahead and enjoy the rest of their day. And hopefully this has been beneficial in giving you an idea of how to actually use scores for targeting. Thanks, and have a good rest of your day.